order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Abhijit Iyer-Mitra is always a delight to have on this program, on this platform. Abhijit knows the Middle East very well, has just returned, in fact, from one of his many, many visits to Israel. As Abhijit returned to India, of course, major news broke around the world that Hassan Nasrallah, the dreaded leader of Hezbollah, had been taken out in an Israeli airstrike. I invited Abhijit today to talk about all of this and what happens really now. It seems like a very delicate juncture has been reached. So we'll talk about what happens to Hezbollah beyond, as it were, Hassan Nasrallah, who led the organization, the terrorist organization, for more than 3 decades. We'll talk about what happens after this in the war in Gaza and, of course, the war in Lebanon and many more things. Abhijit, welcome.
Thank you for having me on as always, Hindol.
Abhijit, let's begin by talking about the impact of the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. Now, here's a man that many people did not think would be eliminated so soon, even weeks ago. So, to many people, this came as a surprise. I mean, this was a man revered by terrorists around the world, the face, quote unquote, for people who think in that manner, of the resistance, so to speak, more than 3 decades as head of Hezbollah. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of his death.
So we need to, I was quite sure that Nasrallah's time was limited, and there's a reason for it. When you see the pattern, first the pagers going off, the next day the wireless handsets going off. There were some solar panels which went off, biometric locks that went off, so on and so forth. What happened was that you then had the airstrikes, which took out the Radwan force. And the moment the Radwan force was taken out, I knew that there was some kind of human intelligence at work out here, right? So obviously, the Israelis learned very well from the 7th of October that you can't just rely on electronic intelligence because it doesn't pick up the kind of nuances and things that human intelligence can. And in intelligence, nuance is everything. So what ended up happening was, at that point, it was almost certain that they had somebody very high up within Hezbollah who was literally pinpointing the fact that all these commanders were meeting, and it was at this specific point, and the entire leadership was taken out at one shot. Now, you would have thought that after the pagers, after the wireless, and after the Radwan force elimination, and several other leaders being eliminated after that in rapid succession, Hezbollah would have thought carefully before organizing a meeting of its leaders or even moving its leaders around, that there was somebody inside. This couldn't just be done by electronic intelligence alone, and that they should have avoided a meeting of the leadership. So, for example, if you look at American attack protocols, when 9/11 happened, which was basically a nuclear attack protocol, the leadership is immediately dispersed. They are not congregated. And yet Hezbollah acted in the exact opposite way, deciding to have a meeting and everything. And honestly, after the Radwan force met, I was like, okay, these guys are now panicking. They most probably are going to end up meeting. And there's a 50-50% chance. There's a 50% chance that they would have dispersed, but there's equally a 50% chance that they will meet. And because, the Americans have very well exercised routines for these kind of things, they would disperse because it is a rehearsed reaction. In this case, in panic, you don't do rehearsed reactions. You ad hoc things and you're not thinking through things clearly, so on and so forth. And they met and they were taken out. Now, Hassan Nasrallah by himself is not, he was no great tactical genius or anything. What he was a political genius who took Hezbollah from being a mere militia into, essentially hijacking Lebanon's foreign policy, its defense policy, and everything like that. And, every Hezbollah victory used to cost Lebanon dearly. So if you look at 2006, which they count as a great victory of theirs, Lebanon paid a very, very dear price for it. So in that political sense, it's a deliverance, I guess, for Lebanon. And if you notice, the prime minister has come out and said he's willing to implement resolution 1701, which essentially calls for the disarming of all militias in Lebanon. And now they finally have the guts to do it. But remember, Amal is still there. They're quite a dangerous organization. Hassan Nasrallah was part of that before he joined Hezbollah as well. So what ends up happening here is tactically zero. The impact on Israel, not that great at all. But the impact on Lebanon itself is massive. We need to understand that this is only because he's literally the cherry on top of the icing on top of the cake. I mean, you can't just eat icing by itself, and those cherries on cakes actually taste quite awful. It's the cake itself, when it all comes together, that works. And that's what we're looking at, because those strikes, they took out the entire middle leadership and lower top leadership. And then the airstrikes took out the top leadership. So you're looking at essentially the cake. I mean, I'm mixing up metaphors here. The cookie has crumbled, but in this case, it's the cake that's crumbled, I guess. And we need to understand, Hezbollah does not operate at, battalion or platoon, battalion or brigade levels. They operate at almost platoon and sub-platoon, even half platoon levels or less. So it is absolutely devastating. I don't think we've seen this kind of decapitation before, except maybe what the American and Russian bombing, all separately, of ISIS did. But that was, over a period of several months, if not years. This was all done in such rapid succession without giving them time to recuperate, think, calm down, and plan their next moves. The downside, of course, is you have the Hezbollah base, the actual platoons, which are very, very dangerous, very radicalized, who are now going to direct their energy at sort of thoughtless revenge attacks. They may also get absorbed into other organizations like Amal, they may even create a new organization. But the point was that, Hezbollah was the international military, sort of the Wagner group of Iran, if you want to call it that. And reconstituting them, is no easy task. It takes years and years and years to do it. Simple example. That damn fool of a man, Paul Bremer, who was the American viceroy to Iraq, he made a very stupid decision dismissing all the Baath Party officials from posts. And, when I use the term secular, I'm using it very loosely in the Arab Muslim world. But those secular Baath Party officials then went on to become, the heads of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Absolutely devastating terror campaign. It took like 7-10 years to dismantle them, or at least inflict enough losses on them. And then they regrouped into ISIS. A lot of them then joined ISIS, which was much quicker to destroy than the Al-Qaeda-led insurgency in Iraq. There was a reason for that, because, every copy, it's like, there are movies made about, sci-fi movies made about genetic cloning. The original is always best, the copy is not so good, and the copy of the copy is not good at all. So you'll see a cloning process now happening with a leadership cloning. But it takes a long, long, long time for an organization to get the kind of military competence and organizational efficiency that Hezbollah had. And that's not going to happen, because from what we're seeing, the Israelis, the moment somebody is nominated to head the organization, they're taking them out immediately. So I'm not seeing horizontal escalation. I'm seeing more of a vertical escalation with lots of different actors. Sorry, we're not seeing vertical escalation, we're seeing horizontal escalation. So it's not going to go up. The escalation is not going up the chain like this. It's going to, filter out to lots of organizations. But even there, if you look at it, what the Israelis are doing is, you need to understand that Hezbollah was, in a sense, Iran's non-nuclear deterrent before the nuclear deterrent came online. It was a gun pointed at Israel's head as a kind of security for the Iranian nuclear program. With Hezbollah gone, I'm completely expecting there to be Israeli strikes on nuclear reactors in Iran, on nuclear facilities in Iran, and on the leadership. In fact, I co-tweeted this video by the Arab spokesperson of the Israeli Defense Forces, which, was a domino effect video. And, after Hassan Nasrallah falls, there are more dominoes where you expect those are the people higher up in the chain in Iran. And I guess that was a statement of intent that they need to go after the Iranian leadership, which is why Ayatollah Khamenei and apparently several members of the cabinet were transferred to safe locations in Tehran, around there. But we've seen how safe those safe locations are, given what happened with the killing of what was his name? I've even forgotten that now, in the guest house in Iran.
I mean, that's one. And of course, nothing is safe when you're facing 1,000-ton, 2,000-ton cluster bombs, which can penetrate bunkers and so on and so forth, which is what happened to Hassan Nasrallah. I mean, he was supposedly in a bunker, but, those bombs can penetrate through those bunkers and so on and so forth. So, as you said, intelligence is very, very important. You mentioned the change of leadership in Hezbollah and other sort of organizations that might spring from it. Now, one of the names that has come up, which I thought was quite interesting, is of course the name of a relative of Hassan Nasrallah, a man called Hashem Saifuddin. Now, Hashem Saifuddin, from what I understand, is very interesting. Not only is he a relative of Hassan Nasrallah, but he's also the father of Zainab Soleimani, the daughter of Qasem Soleimani, a very young lady, but really, in a sense, the ideological heir to Qasem Soleimani, who gave that searing, call for revenge when Qasem Soleimani was eliminated. Now, this, of course, as many people have speculated, this will bring Iran closer and closer in real terms to this battle. How do you see this play out? If Hashem Saifuddin really becomes the head of Hezbollah, it will drag Iran even further in sort of front-facing roles. How do you see this play out?
So the reports I've heard is that Saifuddin has already been eliminated, which is why...
I also read that, but I think there are recent reports saying maybe not. So it's a bit unclear whether he's dead or not.
So like the Mossad joke goes, that electing the new Hezbollah chief is a bit like electing the Pope. Every time the Pope is elected, you see smoke go up. But let's see. I'm waiting to see if this guy comes out of the rat hole and shows his face. He would be very, very scared hiding out somewhere now. I mean, if the Iranian leadership is in hiding right now, Hezbollah leadership should be much more scared. We don't know where they're compromised from, but clearly it is a very, very deep compromise of Hezbollah, which has been worked on for quite some time. And as for Qasem Soleimani, remember, he was taken out by the Americans years back, by Trump. And what ended up happening was there was a ballistic missile attack on an American military base in response to it, which killed nobody. It caused some damage, some injuries, but nobody was killed. What's happening now is, before, they had this sort of confidence to carry out strikes, retaliation strikes. Now their capacity is so depleted, they are not able to do anything without massive retaliation from the Israelis. So you saw the ballistic missile strike from the Houthis, which was responded to massively just a few hours back, literally an hour back, where they've not just bombed Hodeidah. The last time they bombed a oil refinery in Hodeidah. Now they've bombed the entire port. They've bombed lots of facilities in and around Hodeidah and in other parts of South Yemen as well. The actions of Israel are now going to be very, very disproportionate, because that cocked gun to the head has essentially, as far as the Israelis are concerned, been removed. So, this is like, they can claim victory, but these are like moral victories, like Nasser claiming victory after the 67 war and after 1956, or Syria claiming victory after the Yom Kippur War and things like that. I mean, anybody can claim victory. It's just rhetoric. In real life, I think they're on the back foot. They're very scared, which also makes them dangerous because when you are scared, you tend to act irrationally. I really don't know how the Iranians are going to respond because I think they now know that if they respond in any meaningful way, there is going to be direct strikes on Tehran.
Talk a little bit about what happens to the southern parts of Israel. One of the reasons in recent weeks and months pressure had been building up on Netanyahu and his government is because a lot of people, a lot of Israelis had to flee from southern Israel and towards the center of Israel because of the constant Hezbollah rocket attacks. The Druze, those Druze children who were killed to begin with, and then many others, constant attacks on large parts across the border between Lebanon and Israel. Do you see people now having the confidence to slowly going back to their homes?
Not yet, not yet. They're going to take adequate caution and see to it because what they expect right now is a lot of these uh, Hezbollah, the rump Hezbollah, the angry little platoons launching their own uncoordinated strikes across southern Lebanon. Uh, and that is why I think Israel has launched a limited ground operation also into Lebanon sometime during today. So this is one of those things where it's going to take time for those populations to come back. And we need to remember, when we live in India, which is such a huge country, I think the longest domestic flight, I just was on a flight from Coimbatore to Delhi, which was 3 hours. Israeli can't even comprehend a domestic flight that's 3 hours. And similarly, uh, a an F-15 doing Mach 2.2 or 2.2 times the speed of sound can go from the north of Israel to the south of Israel in 22 seconds. So less than a minute, really. So, it's one of those things where in the Indian context, imagine it's a whole border state having been evacuated and depopulated, like say Rajasthan or Gujarat, and people having to live in refugee camps in other parts of India. But they're not going to go back till the Israelis are absolutely certain that the threat has been eliminated. Now, remember, this is just the beginning. This is not the end game. This is the beginning of the end game. And the end game may involve a lot of sallies into southern Lebanon, which is going to be very, very messy, of course. The Israelis don't want to do that. And now the pressure is going to be on the Lebanese government to start disarming Hezbollah. The question is, how will the other Shia faction, the Amal, respond to it? We'll see. I think there is the will in the Sunni leadership and the Christian leadership to do that. The problem is, do they have the means to do that without triggering another civil war?
Because the fear seems to be that, if this is done in a sort of non-thoughtful way, should I say, this might trigger, in some senses, one more, if not a full-fledged civil war, some sort of a quasi-civil war between different demographic groups within Lebanon. And that, of course, will have its own repercussions. Let's talk a little bit about where, Lebanon goes from here. You were just talking about how there could be ground operations, how extensive do you think these ground operations could be? And, how dangerous does Lebanon remain for Israel in the near future?
So the Hezbollah stocks of weapons are absolutely massive. We need to remember that. If you remember during 2006, they used a Chinese anti-ship missile to hit a Israeli stealth frigate, which caused a few deaths and things like that. They still have sophisticated weapons, but sophisticated weapons by themselves are not enough. They need to be targeted. There needs to be intel on what to target, when to target, the coordinates, etc. the more sophisticated the weapon, the more intelligence input required for targeting them, which is not available to Hezbollah right now because they are completely decimated at the levels of leadership and command that require a lot of brains and academic research and study and things like that. So Hezbollah remains a potential threat now. And I don't think the Israelis will want a major ground campaign. The main reason I believe, I could be wrong, I frequently am, is because these guys would be, they're on a high right now. And, they lost that sense of absolute fortress Israel, that almost that impunity that they had prior to 7th October came crashing down on 7th October. But that has been more than largely restored in the last 2-3 weeks. They would not want to go into a messy ground campaign right now and remove the psychological deterrence as well as the
Because
actual
inevitably from such a campaign, some body bags will inevitably come back.
Exactly. Body bags will come back, and then, the entire narrative turns when refugees start moving out and things like that. So I personally don't feel that, but it really depends on what's going on in the war cabinet's mind right now in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem. Sorry.
Let's talk a little bit about the impact Hassan Nasrallah's elimination and Hezbollah's elimination has on the war on Gaza, Abhijit. Because from the time this war began, in many sort of commentary, this entire point was made that, well, Hamas is Hamas, but Hezbollah is an entirely different beast. It's far more threatening, it's far better organized, it has far more sophisticated weapons. In fact, it turns out that the elimination of Hezbollah was far more clean and rapid than the elimination of Hamas.
Exactly right. And, this was one of those things which we never. You tell me, there has never been an intelligence operation in the history of intelligence that has been so comprehensive, so precise, so sustained, uh, clinical almost, except and even the collateral damage has been absolutely minimum compared to the returns. If you notice, even the Iranian ambassador was blinded in the eye. Both his eyes are lost. But Iran's not talking about it. Iran's hasn't mentioned him in a single official statement. Whereas if you remember the last time when their officials were killed at the embassy in Damascus, they sent a huge salvo of drones and missiles into Israel. Of course, only one of them, 7 of them impacted, and all in the desert, and one actually killed a poor Arab Muslim Bedouin boy. Nobody else was killed because he was out in the desert, as Bedouin usually are. So I'm not seeing where, if you're sitting in Tehran today, you're very, very confused. You're very, very scared. But as far as Hamas is concerned, we need to remember the center of Hamas, the real locus, sort of the center, center of gravity. Center of gravity lies in Qatar. It lies in Qatar. It lies in Istanbul as well. And we know Istanbul is part of NATO. Turkey is a NATO ally. Qatar is a treaty ally of America, and those are red lines that the Israelis absolutely will not cross under any circumstances, including, I suspect, assassinations. They could. They've carried out assassinations in Norway, Paris, Rome before. Let's see. As for the ground campaign in Gaza itself, nothing, because what is left now is a mopping up operation. They have control over the Philadelphia corridor, which is that southern strip connecting Egypt to Gaza, which is where all the tunnels were and all the smuggling was happening. And if you look at Hamas's leadership, they haven't been seen in public for months. Yahya Sinwar, we don't know. He's probably hiding out in a tunnel somewhere in
He's
Gaza,
the only one who's left. He's the only major leader who's left. Everybody else is
basically,
dead,
except the ones in Qatar,
except the
Qatar
ones
and
in Qatar.
Istanbul. Uh, let's see what happens there. It's kind of end game. Well, it's not end game. It's the beginning of the end game in the rest, but this is the beginning of the end game for the Hamas leadership. I don't know, but I think Israel's very serious about taking them out as well.
A little bit about intelligence penetration, Abhijit, because surely that's one of the key takeaways from this entire story.
Yeah.
Most people wouldn't have believed that an organization like Hezbollah, backed by Iran, would be so deeply penetrated at every level and with such precision. Now, this, of course, also means, as many people are beginning to point out, that perhaps even the leadership in Tehran is deeply penetrated, maybe to the extent that Hezbollah was penetrated.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, if you look at, for example, the kind of intelligence that Israel collected over Iran's nuclear program, that treasure trove still hasn't been released because it, publicly at least, because it has classified documents on bomb design and manufacturing and things like that. Uh, from the public material, you can kind of extrapolate what's in there. So it's fine. It's a good thing, but it's I don't think the Iranians still realize that there's something happening inside. They should have the assassination in the guest house in Tehran should have been an indicator that something wasn't right. But a lot of the issue that you see with Tehran is people can just get arrested on suspicion alone. And that's not very conducive to a professional counterintelligence operation. If you torture people, they're going to say exactly what you want them to say. So, for example, if there's an organization called, Bengalis Greatest on Earth, and you're the president out there, um, it's one of those things where I can maybe it's your dog that's the spy, but you will then catch hold of your domestic help and your driver and you'll torture them and then say yes, 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 it was me, because poor things, when they're having their eyes gouged out or their fingernails pulled out, they've got nothing else to say, and then you take out your parabellum and shoot them in the head. And of course your dog will never be, your beloved dog will never be touched, and it's the dog that's going around barking in Morse code, giving the information back uh, home. So, it's, uh, uh, this is sort of the genius of democracy in that sense, because it acts as an early warning platform, and the rule of law prevents, it's not so much to protect citizens. Of course, it is to protect citizens, but it also prevents the worst kind of excesses of a government and prevents it from making mistakes like that, which doesn't happen in Iran. It doesn't happen in Hezbollah. It can't happen with the Houthis. It can't happen. Right? The moment they find anybody that they believe is collaborating, they're taken out and executed. It's a sham court. It's a whole of society approach, a whole of society liberal society like Israel can pull off huge, huge, huge victories. A dictatorship can pull off some victories every now and then, but overall, it becomes very difficult.
Two things are apparent from this, apart from the very serious conversation that we are having, that Abhijit takes pot shots at Bengalis, of course, because he's partly Bengali himself. And in his stories, the dogs always get away because he's a big dog lover. But be that as it may, Abhijit, the other very important point you're making, and I want to zero in on that for a moment, is this point about society, which I think is very, very interesting. Surely, and some people are beginning to point this out, surely the infiltration and the hatred for Hezbollah in Lebanon and the hatred for the Islamic regime in Iran has contributed to the deep penetration that Israel has in these two countries?
100%. 100%. And it's also the sort of monotonous, almost homogenized nature of those societies that's also contributed to it. Because, people might be too scared to come out and oppose Hezbollah in public, because when you do, you're immediately killed off. When, for example, Rafiq Hariri was having second thoughts about the Syrian presence in Lebanon, he was blown up in a big car blast, which couldn't have been carried out were it not for Hezbollah's intelligence inputs into Syrian intelligence. Uh, Now, people won't express it openly. When they can't express it openly, they express it covertly. And that covertness invariably leads to disaffection in the ranks, and it leads to people spying for other people. Why is it that not too many Americans defected to the USSR or East Germany or Romania or whatever, but several people there defected to America or the UK or wherever? This is something, and of course, there'll be one or two people like Kim Philby, for example, who fall for the propaganda. George Bernard Shaw fell for that propaganda till he was actually taken on a guided tour of the USSR. He was like, yeah, man,
Yes,
no. So he had a brain. Poor Kim Philby, in spite of his Cambridge or Oxford, I forget where he was, education, did not. So such is life.
Talk a little bit also about how all of this also connects to India, Abhijit, as we wrap up this conversation. A lot of people in India who had obviously forgotten that there is a large Shia population in Kashmir have been very surprised to see a huge outpouring of anger in the Kashmir Valley after the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah. And now there are real question marks about whether this will have any adverse impact in the Kashmir Valley in the months and years that follow?
Very, very good question. I would say no, it's not going to have a major impact, and I'll tell you why. In September 2019, a month after the abrogation of Article 370, when I visited there, I made it a point to visit all the Shia, not all, but many of the Shia villages and things like that, localities, and so on and so forth. And, they were viewed as traitors. Not complete traitors, but significantly not really on the side of the freedom of Kashmir. Because after the Pandits were kicked out, they were seen as the Mukhbirs or the informants of the Indian state, and to a large extent, they were. And every time I'd go to these remote Shia villages, the only posters, there would be no posters of local terrorists as martyrs or anything like that. All the posters used to be Hassan Nasrallah, Lebanon, Imam Khomeini, and things. And their intelligentsia told me it was very important for them to keep their focus on that so that no Shia would get tempted to join the local jihad. So it was a sort of way of, focusing on an external problem so you don't focus on internal problems. And this is sort of one of those things where, obviously, because they've been told, yes, not Kashmir jihad, only Lebanon jihad, Palestine, Lebanon. Realistically, what are they going to do? They've come out and protested, but it wasn't a violent protest. They went throwing stones. They didn't damage anything. They didn't burn buses. They didn't burn cars. They, just went about protesting on the street, and that's perfectly fine. They will let them, but it's not going to translate into anything major.
As we wrap up this conversation, Abhijit, I have one last question. There's, of course, a big American election that's coming up, and a new president will come in America in November. Obviously, Israel is also taking the opportunity of this sort of lame duck government to get a lot of big ticket things done. Depending on who comes to power in November in America, do you see this situation and the relationship with Israel change in any meaningful way?
I think if Kamala comes, there's going to be a very rapid deterioration in relations. And I think in the decision making matrix in Jerusalem, the idea of a Kamala presidency would have played at least 20 to 25% of the input into that decision making. I think they've come to the conclusion Kamala is going to win. and they wanted to take all the actions before Kamala was sworn in or even became president-elect, because if you go by Kamala's speeches, the speech she gave to IPAC, for example, the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, she said, and even I think it was the DNC, not IPAC, that she said, we will protect Israel, we will support Israel to the hilt. But then when Bibi Netanyahu came, and she is the head of the Senate, like, the Vice President of India is the head of the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of parliament, she boycotted that speech. So you have words on one hand and actions on another. I will take actions over words any day. And I think a lot of this has been done, like I said, about 20 to 25% of the decision making was to do this proactively before a Kamala presidency.
We'll wait to see what happens when a new presidency arrives in America. Till then, of course, most likely more turbulent weeks to follow in the Middle East. Abhijit, I'm sure we'll have opportunity to talk to you again about events as they unfold. Thanks very much for your time, for taking off time and explaining all these complicated issues as they have been unfolding, including the elimination, the big ticket information and news, the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Thanks very much indeed for your
Thank
time.
you so much, Hindol. Always a pleasure talking to you.